Hey everyone, it's Laura Kelly with the Nutritional Genomics Institute, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about the ACE2 gene. We did talk about this yesterday a little bit in our roundtable, but I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about how it plays a role in developing COVID-19, which is the disease caused by the virus SARS-CoV-2. So coronaviruses like SARS of 2003 and MERS of 2013, and now this virus, are RNA viruses that typically enter the human cell, and their proteins bind on the cell surface. I actually have a really great picture of this that I'm going to show you since I really like visuals. What's interesting about this virus is that it has an even stronger affinity to the ACE2 gene than other coronaviruses. So that's why talking about this is really important. So we find the ACE2 receptors in the heart, the kidneys, and the intestines, as well as the lungs. So this is why we think we're seeing those early symptoms, such as a dry cough, difficulty breathing, and even GI issues like diarrhea. And this is because this is the tissue that the virus is first entering and impacting. So let's talk a little bit about the ACE2 gene and what it does. So give me a second. I'm going to open up a little PowerPoint presentation that will help us walk through it. All right, here we go. So what we're going to talk about is that ACE2 and ACE, the two genes that really are working on this, are part of the renin-angiotensin system. So this is a hormone system that regulates blood pressure and fluid balance. So it's kind of got a nice visual here. It's showing you which tissue is really impacted by this system. And really, this is about a balancing act. And you'll sort of see that as we talk about it a little bit more. But it's really about sort of having an inflammatory effect, which can be helpful, and then balancing with having an anti-inflammatory effect. So we'll go through that a little bit and talk about it. So what are the roles of ACE and ACE2, and how are they different? So ACE1 converts angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2. And so what does this do? So it actually increases aldosterone, which is a stress hormone. And that increases our fight or flight nervous system. It increases our blood pressure. Sometimes even will turn red. So you can actually feel that blood pressure going up to your head. It creates vasoconstriction. And it can sometimes even create that like rapid heartbeat that you get when you're in a stressful situation. So this is sort of that upregulated system that's happening when the virus is actually going into the cell. And so I'll kind of bring that together and explain that. So something you can have with the ACE gene is called the ACE deletion. So this is why genetics matters. So not everybody has this, but it's actually important to know if you do. And that's because it actually upregulates this conversion. So it actually increases more of that angiotensin and aldosterone. So it can create an even stronger inflammatory response. So what does ACE do? ACE2 do. So ACE2 sort of balances ACE. So it actually converts that angiotensin 2 to almost like an anti-inflammatory form of angiotensin 1-7. And so what it ends up doing is reducing that constriction and causing vasodilation, increases blood flow, and then also has an anti-fibrosis effect. So one of the things we're seeing in people who have COVID-19 is that they're getting lung fibrosis. So part of the reason why that's happening is because the ACE2 gene isn't working as well as it should. So interestingly, ACE2 is in 83% of our cells in the lungs. And so what we're seeing is that this actually acts as the entrance point for the virus. So that's why the lungs are being impacted so much. The other thing is that this particular virus actually downregulates ACE2 expression, which means all those wonderful anti-inflammatory things aren't going to happen when the virus is entering the cell. So it's putting you at more risk of lung injury. So that's what we're seeing. So we're going to go through the pathway a little bit. But first, as I promised, there's a really cool picture of how the virus is entering into the lungs. And I say cool just because it's sort of nerdy, not because it's actually a cool thing that's happening. But what you can see here is that the virus is up here with its spikes. It actually attaches to the ACE2 receptor, which is the AT1 receptor. And then it's facilitated actually by this other gene that's over here. So we're not going to really get into that today. But what's interesting about that is there are gene-to-gene interactions that actually cause this to happen. So sometimes it's important to look at the other genes that are around them to see why something's happening the way that it's happening. So as the ACE2 receptor kind of accepts the virus, it sort of wiggles its way in there and then gets into the cell. And so a lot of times what's happening here is that the ACE gene, the ACE enzyme, is not actually bonded to that receptor in the way that it should. And we'll talk about that. So it creates a gap, which basically allows the virus to come in and bind to that receptor and then come into the cell. So over here, you'll see that there is a picture of the spike. So it's just sort of a neat picture to get kind of a visual of what it looks like. All right, so how does ACE do this? So let's walk through the pathway a little bit. So if we start at the top here, we'll basically start with angiotensin 1. So angiotensin 1 comes down through here and is converted into angiotensin 2 through the ACE gene. So this is actually where ACE inhibitors, which you've probably heard about, so this is a blood pressure medicine, actually stops this process to happening. So if you have something like the ACE deletion and you end up having an overexpression of that and have an increase in blood pressure, or you have a change in your ACE expression in general, even if you don't have the ACE deletion, you're going to have more angiotensin in general. And so those ACE inhibitors kind of go in there and block that process from happening, reducing the amount of angiotensin 2 that you have. So why would we want to do that? Well, because angiotensin 2 is inflammatory. So it's what's increasing your blood pressure. So angiotensin then comes over here and it's basically creating all these processes to then cause that vasodilation and that inflammation and that pro-fibrotic state, so fibrosis. So where does ACE2 come into play? So ACE2 you can kind of see here, and there's some other things happening here as well, which we did talk a little bit about in our roundtable if you want to go back and listen to that. But really what we're going to look at is this conversion here, where angiotensin 2 is converted into angiotensin 1-7. So as angiotensin 1-7 comes down here and binds to the receptors, it causes the opposite effect. So it's going to create that vasodilation, that opening of the blood vessels. It's going to have an anti-inflammatory effect. So it's going to kind of have that opposite balancing effect to what ACE does. And so, of course, you need both. There is a balance there. There's a reason why our blood pressure needs to come up, particularly when we're stressed. It gets you ready for that fight or flight that might need to happen. But you then need the balancing effect of ACE2. So now, if the virus, goes in there and, in the scenario where you've got a lot of angiotensin 2, and so where you have basically this increase in ACE expression, ACE1 expression, and you have high levels of angiotensin 2, the ACE2 gene actually pops off of that ACE receptor. And that sort of opens the door for the virus to come in. And so when that happens, ACE2 cannot bind to that receptor again, and that basically decreases ACE2's ability to convert angiotensin 2 to angiotensin 1-7. So you basically are increasing that inflammatory process. So that's what we're seeing. We're seeing that really rapid increase in lung changes and in blood pressure and the whole sort of process that's happening that we're sort of seeing with people who have COVID-19. So this sort of explains that. So one of the things that they've talked about a little bit too is how some of the blood pressure medications work. And if you have more interest in that, I have some really good resources that I can post. So if you leave a comment, I can certainly add those resources for you if you want to learn a little bit more about that. So basically, a summary: when ACE2 is not able to adequately convert angiotensin 2 to angiotensin 1-7, the body has an increased inflammatory response. And this is why individuals with cardiovascular disease and diabetes, because this is actually increased by cortisol as well, they're more at a risk of complications for COVID-19. All right, so what do we need to do about this? What are some of the things we can do? And so this is kind of the basic things that NGI is recommending right now. Of course, we can do more if we know your genetics, so that's certainly something you can ask us about. But one of the main things that you want to do, which is really hard right now, is keep your stress low. Right? So we want to reduce cortisol, we want to reduce aldosterone. And remember, cortisol actually activates this process. So this was something I talked about in the past Gene Bite about just the ACE gene in general and the angiotensin or the renin-angiotensin system. So if you want to, you can go back and listen to that. But basically, cortisol sometimes starts this whole process. So the virus is creating it as well. But if you're stressed and then you end up having COVID-19, it's going to create a bigger storm. So keeping your stress levels low is super important. So what are some things you can do? I mean, you can take a walk, you can read a book you haven't been able to sit down and read, you can video chat with people. So really find ways, which is hard right now, but find ways to sort of enjoy your day and laugh and have interaction with people through the wonderful technology that we actually have, to do some of the things that you haven't been able to do, keep up with projects that maybe were pushed to the side that you might enjoy. So really starting to think about how you can keep those stress levels low. And of course, going outside is one of the great things we can do right now, as it fortunately is springtime. So something else you can do is look at the different types of nutrients that you really do need and the balance of nutrients. And so the things that have really great research is zinc and vitamin D, vitamin A, lower doses of vitamin C. You don't need to go overboard. And again, we talked about this in our roundtable if you want to go back and listen to that as to why we recommend keeping vitamin C in sort of the lower range. What's interesting about zinc is ACE-2 is actually zinc dependent. So in order for zinc to have, or ACE-2 to have good expression, you actually need to have enough zinc on board. Zinc is also, sort of stops the virus to some extent too, so it has an antiviral effect. So some other things, magnesium in general, but magnesium threonate is great for sleep and just overall metabolic function. So sleep, and I list that down there, sleep and exercise are super important right now. Not overdoing exercise, but moderate exercise. V-Clear or UMCA, we've talked about this a lot too, is also an antiviral that's got some pretty good research backing it. So something to certainly look into, and if you can find it, stock up in it like we all have. So melatonin is really fascinating too. This is specific to this virus. And what they're seeing is that melatonin actually decreases significantly as you get older. And so having enough melatonin on board is going to be really important. So again, I can post that research if you're interested in it, just ask for it. And then theanine is great for anxiety, particularly during this time where things are shifting and we don't really know what's going to happen next. Some information about ACE-2 and just sort of how all of this works. If you have any questions at all, go ahead and post them at the bottom of this Gene Bite, and we'll go ahead and answer those. And anything else that you have questions about or need help with, we're here to support you in any way we can. So have a good day, everyone.